Morning, all. All right, I want to start off talking about what I talked about last night. I want to talk a little bit about power rankings. Now, this is more geared towards newer viewers to the channel, but for veteran viewers to the channel, it's always good to have a bit of a refresher and a discussion. And what I learned about power rankings early on was that A, they'll get a lot of views. It's usually the most viewed video during any given week, and B, people are never going to agree. And one thing that I knew that I needed to do power rankings for when the channel was still relatively young was I didn't agree with other power rankings. It would drive me crazy when I would see a team win all three games that week and then drop because somebody got hurt. And I would see, well, they had a good week. However, this star player got hurt, so we had to drop them. And my response was, that's not how this is supposed to work, is it? So the idea of power rankings and whether or not they should be predictive is something that I understand that it may affect standings, but my opinion was always, look, you know that star player got hurt. You don't know that the team's not going to rally and win those games. So I don't take injuries into consideration at all, for good and for bad. So if a team's on a losing streak and somebody says, well, they're just on a losing streak because of injuries, because again, I don't drop teams because of injuries when they're winning, so it's not going to affect whether or not I keep them higher up when they're losing, because that just throws the whole thing off. The first thing is the idea of objective power rankings versus subjective, and I admit mine are subjective. I went back and forth on mine last night for about 20 minutes after I was done with the review, and that was after I had already been going over that board during the day. And the biggest problem right now is there are so many teams with similar records. Being able to say, okay, this team is the best in the league right now, it gets difficult. And you've got so few games played. So when I'm looking at power rankings and when I'm making adjustments, and I do make the adjustments daily, and I've seen people say, well, he's lying about that. Why would I lie about that? Honestly, it might be easier if I did it once a week, but I found that there were a couple of times I tried doing it once a week, and it took longer for me to get it done. So kind of like last night, right? And I didn't find that it really changed much of anything. I do like making those changes. So for instance, today Seattle's playing against Chicago. I think that game's more important for Seattle's standing than for Chicago's. If Seattle has a terrible game, I'm going to have to revisit where Seattle is in their placement. If Chicago has a terrible game, well, that's kind of baked into how the plan was to start the season, so that's not really going to negatively impact them. Anaheim and Detroit, that's an important game for Detroit. Anaheim's pretty far down there, and Anaheim's putting up a good fight in their games, but they're still not getting the results. Columbus Rangers, important for the Rangers. If the Rangers have a setback, if the Rangers have a tough time with Columbus, I will revisit where they are on the board. At the same time as the Islanders are playing Florida, that's an important game for Florida, right? The Islanders are 2-3. Florida is supposed to be a Stanley Cup contender. The Islanders missed the playoffs last year. San Jose, Philadelphia, that's a big one for Philadelphia. They are coming off of a win over Nashville last night. They looked very good, and it's about how they do in that second game of a back-to-back, which I'll talk about. So that's how I view it when I'm looking at the games. Is this is more important for this team than for this team? Even early in the season, I view it that way, where I'm maybe a little bit tougher on the team that's higher up than the team that's lower down, and I'm more likely to reward the team that's lower down than the team that's higher up. So that's how I look at it. Now, results are just part of it. So I mentioned, the results and, wins, losses, and all. That's important. I think there's a lot of focus on that, but I think early in the season, there may be too much focus on that. For instance, last night, number 32, and I'm not spoiling anything, is Vancouver. Now, you can make an argument that Vancouver wouldn't belong at number 42, or no, 42. Yeah, they're probably 10 teams that don't even exist. But the you can make the argument that they shouldn't be last in the league if you look at it from a perspective of they've had a lot of leads, they can't hold them. Meaning, they've had some good starts to the games. All they have to do is figure out how to finish them. Whereas I'm looking at it and going, the fact they've blown those leads is worrying and ends up dropping them down to bottom, right? So that's the difference right there, is that people could make that argument of, hey, they're not that bad. If they'd held on to a lead in even two of those games, we wouldn't be having these discussions about Boudreaux being fired and need to trade everybody. And it's Vancouver, so of course you're going to have those discussions. But results are just part of it because how they won, how they lost is also important. So last night, Pittsburgh beats Columbus 6-3. Really telling with Columbus was the fact that they blew a couple of leads again. So the teams in the bottom row are often going to be the ones that are not keeping leads, or maybe they're just getting absolutely annihilated, right? And so how a team wins or loses is going to make a big difference. For instance, Arizona. Arizona has a lot of fight, but they don't have that talent level where you're expecting a lot from them. So they're going to get destroyed a lot this year. And if you're an Arizona fan, that's kind of baked into how this is set up. Now, as the year goes on, they're going to win games that they're not expected to, but I don't expect them to move out of the bottom row. Strength of schedule also is going to play a role. It's tougher to gauge strength of schedule early in a season because I'm a firm believer that what happened in 2021, 2022 doesn't necessarily impact this season. One thing that causes me to talk to my TV a lot, I'm old, I do that, and as I get older, I do it more, is when I hear somebody say, and I heard this on, I think it was on TSN, well, it's going to be really tough for this team to make up for that 23 point gap. I can't remember how much it was. I think it was like 23-point gap between themselves and the playoffs last year, and I thought, and said out loud, well, they don't have to make up a gap. They just have to be good this year. Like last year's results that's great, but everybody starts at zero. So you don't have to make up a 25-point gap right now. There isn't one. So it's up to the team to make sure that 23, 25, however many point gap doesn't happen. And so that's really key to me is that there's a new season. I think it's a clean slate. There are limits to that, of course. There are definitely limits to that, especially if a team is dominant from one season into the next, things don't change, or terrible from one season into the next, things don't change. So yeah, strength of schedule is hard to measure right now early in the season, which is why, and I'm going to get into 6 before 5, I guess, but because I thought, well, strength of schedule leads into 5, but really with 6, it's more important to talk about it here. So less movement as the season progresses is how the power rankings end up working, and I know it drives some people bonkers, where a team might go 0-2-1 that week, and maybe they just drop one spot. But we get an idea for who the good teams are and who the good teams aren't, right? And so maybe a bad team, maybe a mediocre team, has a really good week, but it's just that one really good week, and they're still not really in a contending position. Maybe the teams they were against weren't the best in the league. Maybe that week, maybe they beat Chicago, San Jose, and Columbus. And so it's like, okay, so yeah, they won those 3 games, but the teams they beat, right? So there's definitely less movement as the season progresses, and I know that's driven people crazy. I've had power rankings where maybe a third of the teams don't move from one week to the next. But early in the season, we're still figuring out who's where. Philadelphia is a really good example. Are they for real? We're almost to the point where I'm going to have to do a video on that with the Philadelphia Flyers and say, okay, so what parts of this are sustainable and what parts of this may not be, right? One thing that I do look at, so I'm going to go back to number 5 on this, is back-to-backs and 3 games in 4 nights. I understand, again, it's early in the season, so teams shouldn't be that tired, but I don't think that should be written off completely. I think if you have a team that's got a couple of days of rest and another one that's coming in on 3 games in 4 nights, especially if they're on the road, I think that, some form of, not necessarily exhaustion, but just you have your physical limits. And while these are elite athletes, I understand they're going to have, it's going to be tough to maintain that level of intensity 3 times in 4 days. So I don't hold it against them a lot of the time. And I may be more forgiving of a team that, loses that second half of back-to-back, especially if, let's say it's the Rangers, right? They go in against Pittsburgh. Rangers-Pittsburgh, usually, pretty intense rivalry. So they go in against Pittsburgh and they beat them 5-0. Great game. The next night, they go in and they play, say, Montreal, right? Montreal's down in the dumps. They've lost 8 in a row. And the Rangers lose to them 3-1. So I'm going to look at that and say, it's tough to get up for that game the day after you had this big emotional win over Pittsburgh. And, especially if they're on the road, they win in Pittsburgh, go to Montreal and lose that next game. I understand. That's where the trap game comes in too, right? The idea that there's games you might overlook in your overall schedule because you're looking ahead to the next one, or maybe you're thinking about the last game. I don't think that's a sign of weakness for players. I think that's just how that works. I think it's easy to overlook a team that's got 10 wins in their first 50 games and put more importance on the game that's coming up against the team that's won 40 out of their first 50 games. So the trap is there. But yeah, that's something that's important, and I do consider that too. So when coming back to the strength of schedule, if you lose against Arizona a night after you destroyed Vegas, I might be a little more forgiving with that, which is where the subjective comes in with the objective. The objective wouldn't care. That wouldn't matter. And then the one thing that's going to become more and more of an argument as the season goes on, and it always does, how dare you have Team A over Team B because that team is actually below the other team in the standings, so this doesn't work. Power rankings should not be a reflection of standings. Power rankings, in reality, should be the idea that these are the teams that are playing the best hockey right now. Now, the teams at the top should be the best teams at that moment, but it's not always the case. You will have teams that go through those dips. Like, for instance, Carolina had a fantastic start to the season. Last year, they were absolutely amazing, and then they went through, I think it was like a 5 or 10 game period where they didn't look very good. And then they turned it around and got it back together. So standings didn't dictate whether or not Carolina fell, because Carolina had built up a pretty good cushion in terms of being a playoff team, one of the best teams in the Metro. But when they started playing poorly, they started dropping in the power rankings, probably behind some teams that they were actually ahead of in the standings, because in that moment, I didn't feel like they were playing as well. But the most important thing with power rankings is people will not agree. And it's something I learned as this channel went along. It's something that I've told people, and they've asked me, I'm thinking about starting a YouTube channel. What should I do? I always say just stick to your guns, be true to your own vision. People are going to criticize, they're going to troll, they're going to do what they're going to do, and you have to stay true to yourself and keep it as consistent as possible. The only change in the power rankings over the last 4 years has been that they've gone from being reactive to not as reactive. Now, early in the season, they're going to be, because, again, teams are kind of telling us who they are early in the season, and we may be surprised by some good teams that actually turn out to be not very good, and some not very good teams that tell us they're actually quite good and they've got it all together. Again, Philly's a good example there so far. But when it was a reactionary power rankings, I couldn't say, well, this team is clearly number one because, other than saying, well, they won a bunch this week, so they moved up. So that was where my opinion didn't matter. I just had a system where team moves up when they win, team moves down when they lose. This is what the board's telling me. And eventually, I couldn't do that anymore. I said, no, I can't defend these power rankings anymore. So I had to change it to where I said, you know what, if a team loses or a team wins, it doesn't necessarily mean moving up or moving down the power rankings. So that's where we're at right now. And yeah, you guys can feel free to refer back to this when you're really angry about where a team is placed. And again, I've been getting a kick out of some of the comments telling me that how wrong I am about the reverse retros, and how dare you? You must hate this team if it's a shirt. If I say I don't think that shirt's that great, doesn't mean I hate that team. It's the most bizarre thing. It is one of the weirdest things ever. I mean, if somebody says, "Hey, look, I bought a new shirt," and I say, "I'm not a huge fan of the shirt," would they look at me and go, "Why do you hate me?" I don't hate. I'm saying that the shirt, you clearly hate me. I don't. So, it's not like if my wife gets something that I have to tell her I like it, because if I don't, it means I hate her. That's not how that works. So I just compared a hockey team. No, that's okay. No, I'll stick with that. Anyways, there you go. Because, my other marriage is clearly to hockey. So there you go. But let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And the most important thing I can say is the power rankings are for fun. I enjoy doing them. I think it's fun to look at the board, and every day when I do the updates, I'm kind of surprised at times with where teams are at on the board. And there are times too where I might make a big adjustment and I think, oh, I don't want to make that adjustment back. And I'll close on this. One example is having Colorado in the spot they're in right now. I feel like I'm going to be moving them up pretty quickly, and that they won't be staying in that spot for very long. But they did not have a great week overall. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, like I said. And hey, Thanks for all your support. It means a lot. And again, it's not to be taken overly seriously, and it feels like sometimes people do take it that way, but it's the internet. That's how that works. Thank you guys again for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.